In February 2024, the Power BI team introduced some brand new features that aim to make DAX simpler and more approachable for the average user, most notably something called visual calculations. In this video, I'll introduce what visual calcs are all about, walk through some demos, and summarize the major pros and cons to be aware of. Now, a couple important notes to keep in mind. Number one, this is a high-level introduction, so we'll cover the basics here, but save some of the more custom or complex functionality for a future video. And two, these are brand new as of February 2024 and still in preview mode. So keep in mind that things are changing very, very quickly. So with that, let's talk about what visual calculations are all about. Visual calcs are basically DAX calculations that are tied to a specific visual on the report canvas. They aren't added to your model like traditional calculated columns or measures, which means that they only exist within the scope of that visual and can't be used or referenced anywhere else. So take a look at this matrix here where we're showing total orders by month and by year, and we've got some additional calculated fields like a running sum, moving average, and some comparisons between time periods. Now you might notice that these feel really similar to things like table calcs in Tableau or pivot table value calculations in Excel. But these are examples of Power BI's new visual calculations, which are indicated by the icons that you see here. And by editing one of these calculations, you'll see that we have a whole new environment inside of Power BI where we can create and modify these visual calcs. We've got a visual preview at the top and a calculation pane at the bottom, which shows the DAX formula itself here in the formula bar, along with the underlying data matrix that Power BI is using to produce the visual above. Now in this case, it looks almost identical since we're working with a matrix visual, but this can be really handy when using other types of charts and graphs where the underlying data structure isn't quite this clear. So let's talk about the major benefits of visual calculations. Number one, because they're stored on the visual, they don't bloat the data model with extra columns or measures. This is perfect for cases where you only need to show a calculated field in one place or at one level of granularity. This yields significant performance benefits as well because they can operate on aggregated data compared to traditional calculated columns, which are defined and stored at row-level granularity. Number two, they're calculated using visual context. In other words, the data that you see right in front of you, which combines the simplicity of calculated columns with the on-demand calculation flexibility of measures. And this creates a more intuitive, almost spreadsheet-like calculation experience. And third, with the introduction of visual calculations comes a brand new suite of templates and functions that make writing and managing DAX much simpler. And this is especially true with things like ranks or running totals, which can be really tricky if you're new to Power BI or if you're working with large or complex models. So for example, if I click this FX icon to the left of the formula bar, you'll see we've got these pre-built templates for things like running sum, moving average, percent of parent, different types of averages or positional references. And in this case, we're able to define a running total using a single function and measure reference, running sum total orders, which is so much easier than writing a traditional measure to do the same thing, which would look something like this. So now that we have that context, let's go back to our report view and practice creating some visual calcs from scratch. Now, if you'd like to follow along, I've added a new tab here called Visual Calcs with 3 different visuals on the canvas. We've got a matrix showing year and start of month with our total orders measure on values. Got a second matrix, which is showing the category name, subcategory name, and product with total revenue, cost, and profit measures. And finally, we've got a bar chart here, which is showing data broken down by occupation with total customers here on the x-axis. And we'll start with our total orders matrix here because time intelligence is one area where these visual calculations really shine. So check this out. If I select this visual, we now see an option here in the Home tab where we can select New Calculation. And this is what we'll use to define our visual calcs. So let's go ahead and give it a click. That's going to open up our new visual calculation environment. And what I want to do here is really just walk through some of these pre-built templates to give you a sense of how these things work. Let's start with a running sum. You can see it drops in a formula right here in the formula bar with a brand new function that they're calling running sum. This is an example of syntax sugar, or it's basically a shortcut that hides a lot of complicated stuff working behind the scenes with window functions like index and offset. Power BI is trying to make this as intuitive and seamless for users as possible. So it rolls up into this very simple function with just a single argument, which is the field name. This is where I can input any columns or fields or measures or other visual calcs that are part of this visual. In this case, I can choose start of month, total orders, or year. In this case, I want the running sum or the running total of orders. So I'll select that measure and press enter. And there you go. Now we have a running sum, which basically just adds up the total orders and aggregates them into the total all the way down to the grand total of 13,325. Very, very simple, very straightforward stuff. Let's try a moving average here. Again, we've got another custom function introduced with Visual Calcs called moving average. This time we've got two arguments. Again, we're going to start with the field reference. Again, total orders. Now, window size, this is basically how many items we want to include in our average. So we could start with something like 2 and press enter. And what that's going to do is basically just average the previous 2 items at any view in our visual. So for instance, 174.5 is the average of 184 and 165, and so on and so forth. This works at different layers of granularity, so as you roll up or down, those calculations still calculate properly, no matter what level of granularity you're looking at here. So that one's pretty straightforward. What if we wanted to change the window from 2 to 3? Well, we could head to our build visual pane here, click this right arrow, edit the calculation, and just swap the 2 for a 3. Press enter, and we'll see our calculation change. Next up, let's take a quick look at some of these comparisons here versus previous, next, first, and last. We'll circle back to the percent of parent and children, but for now, let's try something like versus previous, this kind of positional reference here. Again, very simple formula, just 2 arguments. They both reference a field name. And as always, we're going to reference total orders. And all we're doing here is comparing the total order value against the previous one. And like we talked about, this is really simple when you're dealing with tools like Excel, but can be much trickier to accomplish using traditional DAX. This makes it much, much easier. So total orders of 165 in February 2020, that's 19 fewer orders than the previous month. 198 is 33 more than 165. That's what the versus previous calculation is doing. And then very, very similar case for versus next. And let's just show it just to be complete here. Total orders. Instead of referencing the last value, this is just going to reference the next value. Again, this works even as you roll up or down or drill in or out of your matrix. It's still going to calculate properly, which is great. And then last thing we'll see is the versus first and last. So same 2 arguments as always. This should be familiar by now. Total orders, total orders. This one's going to reference against the first visible value in the visual. In this case, 184 is the first value at this layer in the matrix. So every other value is referenced against that 184. And then, of course, versus last is going to do the exact same thing. But instead of referencing the first value, it's going to reference the last visible value in the visual. So let's go ahead and enter that in. So now we're just comparing against 2056. That's our baseline for all of these versus last calculations here. Now, what's great about this is that you might create visual calculations as helper columns that contribute to other calculations. You might replace measures that you no longer need to show in the visual. What you can do is update these show hide options to determine exactly what's visible inside of your visual. So for instance, maybe we don't need all of those calculations we just created. Maybe we only want the running sum, the average, and versus previous. We can keep these calculations here, but temporarily hide them from the visual itself. So with that, let's jump back to our report. You can see that our visual will update with those new fields that we added, which looks good. And now next up, I want to take a look at some of these other templates for percent of parent, average of children, things like that. And to do that, we're going to take a look at our product matrix here. And again, we'll go to Home, New Calculation to get into our Visual Calc environment. And it's worth noting that we don't have to use the templates. This is really just a collection of shortcuts to make these calculations easy for everyday users. But you can write your own custom DAX in here, which is great if you need something a bit more complex or a bit more custom. In this case, suppose we wanted to calculate a visual calculation version of profit, which is revenue minus cost. You can see we have the measure version of profit already visible in our visual. Could give this one a name like profit, and just like any other calculated column, right, we can reference the fields here like total revenue minus total cost and press enter, and that's going to add our visual calculation for profit, and you can see that our values match perfectly, which is great. And again, this can be really helpful for scenarios where maybe we only need to show profit in one single chart, or we only care about profit at the product category level. In those cases, visual calculations could be much more performant and efficient than defining a profit calculated column or measure that evaluates at the row level granularity. And one thing you might have noticed is the formatting or lack thereof. So we were able to format our profit measure exactly as we wanted to, in this case with a currency format. We currently don't have the ability to do that with visual calculations. There's no formatting menu that we can access here. So what we have to do, at least for the time being, is force the format using a format function inside the formula bar. So let me show you what that looks like. We can edit the calculation, and all I'm going to do is wrap that formula in a format function. And in this case, we're going to format it as currency, which will look something like this. And we're going to round it down. We don't need decimal points. So we'll use a kind of format string like this. And now when we press enter, you can see those values update, and now it's formatted just like we had formatted that measure version as well. So suppose this matrix is really all about profit calculations. In that case, maybe we could choose to hide some of these component fields. We can hide the original profit measure as well. And now we're left just with that profit visual calc that we defined. Next up, let's explore some of those other templates that we haven't looked at yet, starting with percent of parent. And this one looks a little bit more complicated, right? We've got a couple different functions in here, divide and collapse, which is a brand new DAX function that you may not be familiar with, but there's still only 3 user inputs that we need to deal with, and 2 of them are just referencing the field that we care about, which in this case is profit. So I'm actually going to reference the measure version of profit, which I can, even though it's not visible right now, and I'll show you why in just a second. So total profit. Now the axis, this will be either rows or columns, depending on how our matrix is oriented. In this case, we have our product and category and subcategory fields on rows. So we'll use a rows argument here. If we had transposed that and put our product names on columns, we could use columns as this argument instead. But that should do the trick. If I go ahead and press enter, you can see we've got these percent values. Again, not formatted by default, but this is basically telling us for any given category, what percentage does it represent out of its parent values, right? So if we look at subcategories first, jerseys represented 48% of the total clothing profit, which is its parent category. Gloves represented 39%, and caps represented the remaining 13%. And then within those subcategories, we can see the breakdown or composition of profit at the product level, right? So this short sleeve classic jersey in extra large accounted for 11% of the total jersey profit. That's how you interpret a percent of parent calculation. And we could go ahead and format that one just like we did with our last calculation. We're going to wrap it in a format function. And this time we could use something kind of like this. We'll round it off, add a percentage sign, and there we go. That's a bit more readable now. Next up, let's look at the percent of grand total. This one's pretty intuitive, but again, uses some brand new functions like collapse all. Let's go ahead and reference the total profit measure again here. Total profit. Again, we're going to deal with rows as our axis. And let's just get ahead of it and add our format while we're thinking of it. I'm going to wrap all of that in a format function. And let's use that same percent format like we did before, like so. So now we have percent of grand total instead of percent of parent. And the difference is that now at every single level, whether it's subcategory or product, we're basing that percentage calculation against the grand total value. So now the difference is that that same short sleeve classic jersey that made up 11% of jersey profits, now we're seeing that it only makes up 5% of the overall profits. So similar calculation, just a slightly different perspective, different way of looking at profit performance. All right, so last but not least, let's take a look at this last one, average of children. This is going to use an expand and an average function here. Just two arguments. You can see this is super easy, just field and axis again. And this time, instead of the measure version of profit, I'm going to point to the visual calculation version of profit. And again, I'll show you why in just a sec. Axis is going to be rows. Let's go ahead and lock that in. And what happens? Well, we get an error. It says we can't display the visual. And if you read the error line here, it says the function average cannot work with values of type string. So let's go back and edit this calculation. You might be wondering, well, what the heck? We're averaging profit, which is a numerical value field, right? Well, the catch is that when we included that format function, we actually turned our profit visual calc into a text string, and text strings can't be averaged. So there are two things we could do to fix this. We could either remove the format statement from our profit calculation, or we could reference the total profit measure, which is properly formatted as a value. So we kind of have to make a little bit of a trade-off here. In this case, let's go ahead and reference the measure version and press enter. And when we do that, all is well, and we get the proper averages here in our visual preview. And to interpret these averages of children, basically we're looking at the average of the next layer of granularity. So when we look at the clothing line, which is the highest level of granularity here in this visual, we are averaging each subcategory. So the profit for jerseys, gloves, and caps averages out to 31,244. And then within those subcategories, we're averaging out the product level profits that they contain. So let's head back to our report. Last thing I want to show you is a non-matrix example. Here we've got a bar chart that's showing our total customer count by occupation. And by default, we're using our total customer measure, which is a count of customers. But suppose that instead of showing the counts here, we actually wanted to modify this visual a little bit and actually turn this into a percent of total visual. Now, I could start defining a whole bunch of DAX functions using calculate, all, and divide, add a bunch of measures to our models, but this is actually a great use case for visual calcs. So let's jump into our calculation pane here, and let's add a calculation for percent of grand total, and the field that we're dividing is total customers, and we're going to collapse total customers. And we're dealing with data on rows here, which we can see in our visual matrix preview. Let's press enter. Now, by default, it's going to show both of those fields in the same visual, which doesn't make sense. They're on totally different scales. And just like before, we don't really need to show the volume metric anymore. We just want to visualize this as percentages. So we can hide that original measure from the visual. And let's jump back to our report now. And now we're looking at just those percent of totals. We could format those as percentages as well, but we could also do some cool things like we could sort based on those grand totals now. And if we wanted to do a little bit of formatting, maybe we add some data labels and we put them inside of the ends of the bars. And now we've got a visual that shows the percent of total customers broken down by occupation. And we didn't even have to add a single new measure to our model. So really nice common use case for when visual calculations can really come in handy. So now that we've seen visual calculations in action, let's recap some of the major pros and cons. Now on the pro side, this new concept of visual context is a game changer. It makes DAX simpler and more intuitive, especially for large models or complex calculations that require positional references, things like ranks or running totals, that traditionally are quite challenging to define using normal DAX measures. Visual calculations can also be quite a bit more performant than traditional calculated columns because they can be applied at aggregated levels or to specific individual visuals. And as a result, you can avoid model bloat. They reduce the need for extra unnecessary calculated columns and measures in the semantic model. And again, this is ideal when you just have a metric that you want to show in one chart in your report or at one specific level of granularity. One of the nice things about Visual Calcs is that they include all of those pre-built templates and the supporting function set as well. Functions like expand, collapse, running sum, first, next, etc. This makes it so much easier to use these functions compared to the underlying window functions that are actually driving the calculations. And one thing that I find super helpful is the visual calculation editor and how it shows the exact data structure behind a specific visual on the canvas. This is really helpful, especially for brand new Power BI users. And then last but not least, love that Visual Calcs allow you to customize which calculations or fields are shown or hidden inside of a visual. That level of flexibility is a really nice touch. Now, on the con side, for one, this does create a pretty fragmented DAX authoring and editing experience. There are now 3 or 4 different places where you can write DAX code inside of Power BI Desktop. And the challenge is that the functionality is kind of inconsistent between them. So there are certain DAX measures and functions that might work in one place, but not in another. And trying to find and edit those visual calculations can be a little bit tricky at first. Another con is that these calculations are isolated to specific visuals, and you can't use them or reference them elsewhere. In fact, at this point, I don't even think you can copy and paste visual calculation code between different visuals. So you do end up having to create these visual calcs from scratch each time you need to produce them. Now, because these are brand new, they're currently only compatible with a subset of basic native visuals. At this point, they don't work with maps, they don't work with combo charts, they don't work with custom visuals. And like we showed, there are pretty limited formatting, filtering, and sorting options here. You can't use conditional formats, you can't use data categories, you can't even use standard formatting options. You need to use a format function to kind of force these visual calculations into the formats that you're looking for. I do expect this one to get better over time as we get closer to general availability. There's also quite limited functionality as far as Power BI Service is concerned. So you can't edit Visual Calcs in Service. You also can't publish reports to web that use visual calculations. And then last but not least, remember, this is still a preview feature, so documentation is limited, and features really do continue to change pretty frequently. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Visual Calcs, head to learn.microsoft.com, and here you'll find some really helpful resources, including this article here about visual calculations that talk about how to enable them, talks about the editing pane, talks about how to hide fields, how to use the templates. These are the different axis options that we talked about, rows and columns. And then one thing that's super helpful at the bottom, these are all of the new available functions and what they do. And then there's a whole kind of comprehensive list of current limitations as well. So there you have it. That's our overview of Power BI's new visual calculations. Hope you found it helpful. And if you've taken some time to play with these on your own, go ahead and drop me a comment and let me know what you think.